7:12 on a Wednesday morning that I will never forget. I was on my knees in the back kitchen of a restaurant I had kept alive for 17 years, fishing a clog out of the grease trap with a shop rag and a coat hanger because the drain company we'd contracted wouldn't show up until Thursday and we had a full lunch reservation book. The smell was exactly what you'd expect. My hands were in it up to the wrist, and somewhere upstairs, in the private dining room we only used for investor meetings, my new general manager was telling the ownership group that I was a liability to the brand. I didn't know that part yet. I just knew the drain was clogged and somebody had to fix it. My name is Russell Holt, 51 years old, chef and kitchen director at a restaurant called 44th and Vine for the better part of 2 decades, starting back when the place was a 30-seat bistro above a dry cleaner on a block that nobody wanted, run by men named Edward Callum who had more passion than capital and needed someone who could do both. I was that someone. I built the kitchen from a 6-burner range and a reach-in cooler. I wrote the first menu on a legal pad at Edward's kitchen table over bad coffee and good intentions. I sourced every vendor, negotiated every contract, trained every line cook who ever stood at those stations. When the health inspector showed up unannounced in 2011 and the walk-in was running 4 degrees warm, I talked him through it while simultaneously calling the refrigeration tech on my cell phone behind my back. We passed. When the roof leaked during a Saturday dinner service in 2014 and water started coming through the ceiling tiles above table 6, I rerouted the entire dining room, repositioned the service flow, and we lost exactly 0 covers. The guests thought it was a private event setup. That's what I did. For 17 years, I held the seams together so the place could keep growing, and it grew. 40 seats became 90. 1 location became 3. Revenue went from $400,000 a year to over $4 million. Edward gave me a title, executive chef and director of culinary operations, and a salary that was reasonable if you didn't count the hours. I never counted the hours. I should have. Edward sold the group in 2021. Private equity out of Atlanta. They kept his name on the letterhead for 6 months while they restructured everything underneath it. New ownership, new managing partners, and eventually a new general manager named Clifton Marsh, who arrived with a consulting background, a collection of quarter-zip pullovers, and the kind of confidence that only exists in people who have never worked a double on a Friday night in August. Clifton called the kitchen a cost center. That was the first thing he said in our first meeting. Not hello, not nice to meet you. He walked in, looked at my prep schedule, and said, "This is a cost center, and we're going to start treating it like one." I looked at him for a long moment. I said, "It's also the reason anyone walks through the front door." He smiled at me like I was a child who didn't understand how businesses worked. Things moved fast after that. Clifton brought in a food cost consultant who'd never cooked a day in his life but had a lot of opinions about portion sizing. They changed my ordering system without telling me, then blamed me when the produce deliveries got confused. They switched our protein supplier to save 11 cents per pound and spent the next month wondering why the beef wasn't selling. I told them. They didn't listen. Then they hired a new sous chef over my head. A kid named Blake, fresh out of culinary school, who I was apparently now supposed to consult before making menu changes. Blake was fine. Blake wasn't the problem. Blake was just the messenger for a message I didn't want to receive. The email came on a Monday. Subject line, alignment meeting, culinary leadership structure. That phrasing. Alignment. Like I was a wheel that needed rotating. I'd been in this business long enough to know what that word meant in a corporate context, and it wasn't anything good. I printed the email, folded it, put it in my breast pocket, and went back to prepping the Tuesday family meal for my team like I always did, because whatever was about to happen, my people still needed to eat. The meeting was in the private dining room the following morning. Clifton was there. One of the managing partners from Atlanta, a man named Davis, who I'd met twice and who both times had been more interested in his phone than in me, and a woman from HR I had never seen before, which told me everything I needed to know before I even sat down. They used the word restructuring. Clifton used the phrase culinary vision alignment. Davis talked about the brand moving in a new direction. None of them could look me in the eye for more than 3 seconds. I sat there in the same work coat I'd worn for 6 years. The one with my name embroidered on the chest by the woman at the dry cleaner downstairs from the original location. She'd done it as a gift when we hit our first $100,000 month, and I listened to them describe the end of 17 years with the same energy you'd use to explain a software update. They offered me a severance package, 2 months, non-disparagement clause, Return of all company property, including my key cards, my vendor login credentials, and this is the part I want you to remember, any proprietary recipes, formulas, and documentation associated with the restaurant's culinary program. I looked at the HR woman. Any proprietary recipes? I said, sure. Absolutely, I'll get you everything. I took the folder, stood up, shook nobody's hand, walked out through the kitchen, past my prep cooks, past the line I'd built from nothing, through the back door and into the alley where I'd taken 100 phone calls and eaten 100 rushed lunches over 17 years, and I sat on the loading dock steps and I did not cry. I called my wife instead. She picked up on the first ring, which meant she'd been expecting it. She always knew before I did. She said, come home. I said, not yet, I need to think. She said, Russ, you know what you have. She was right. I did know. Here's the thing about running a kitchen for 17 years. You don't just accumulate experience. You accumulate paperwork, contacts, agreements, relationships, things that exist in the physical world and not just in the cloud-based system some consultant set up in 2022. I drove to my house and sat in my office, which is really just the back bedroom with a filing cabinet and a folding table, and I started going through what I actually had. Not what they thought I had. What I actually had. The vendor contracts were the first thing. When the group expanded to 3 locations in 2018, I had negotiated directly with our top 5 suppliers: the produce farm in Lexington, the protein distributor in Nashville, the specialty dairy company, our seafood broker, and the artisan bread baker we'd been using since 2007. I had done that negotiating personally, in my name, because at the time we didn't have a procurement department and Edward had trusted me to handle it. The contracts were written on the restaurant's letterhead, but the signatory on every single one of them was Russell Holt, not 44th and Vine, not the corporate entity, me, because nobody else had been there to sign them. I pulled out the produce contract first, read through it slowly, the way you read something you wrote yourself, and forgot how serious it was. The language was standard except for one clause that our lawyer, my neighbor's husband, a real estate and business attorney named Jerome, who I paid $200 in 2018 to look it over because Edward was traveling and it needed to be done, had quietly added at my request. A transferability clause. The contract would transfer to any entity Russell Holt chose to assign it to. Jerome had said at the time, you probably won't need this, but it doesn't hurt. I pulled the seafood broker contract, same clause. I had asked Jerome to add it to all 5 when I renewed them in 2019, because I'd started having a feeling, the kind you get when you've watched enough companies change hands, that you should always know what you're holding before you're asked to set it down. The new ownership had never asked about the vendor contracts. Clifton had complained about our ingredient costs plenty of times, but it had never once occurred to him to look at who actually held the agreements that kept the kitchen supplied. They were so focused on the quarterly P&L and the rebranding initiative. They'd spent $40,000 on a new logo, by the way, and it looked like something generated by a machine that they had forgotten to check what was actually keeping the lights on. The second thing I had was the recipe documentation. Now, they had asked for my proprietary recipes in the severance agreement. But here's what Clifton and Davis and the HR woman with the good shoes didn't understand. I had never signed an intellectual property agreement. In 17 years, not once. Edward had never asked me to, because in the beginning we were 2 guys trying not to go under, and the concept of IP assignment was somewhere below commercial dishwasher repair on our priority list. And when the private equity group acquired the company in 2021, their legal team had sent over a stack of new employment agreements for everyone to sign. I had signed most of them, but the IP clause in the new agreement had specifically listed existing recipes and historical menu documentation as company property, and I had questioned it, and Clifton had said, don't worry about it, it's just standard, and I'd said I'd like to have my own attorney review it before signing that section, and Clifton had said sure, just send it back when you're ready, and I had said okay. And then we'd both gotten distracted by the fact that our entire front-of-house staff had quit the same week over a scheduling dispute Clifton had caused, and the IP addendum had sat on my desk unsigned for 9 months, and then it had moved to my filing cabinet, and then it had moved to my filing cabinet at home. It was still there, still unsigned. They had asked me to return proprietary recipes. The recipes were mine. I called Jerome. He answered on the 3rd ring. I heard his lawnmower in the background and then silence when he cut it. I said, remember those vendor contracts from 2018? He was quiet for a second, Then he said, "Russell, what happened?" I told him. By the time I finished, I heard his back door open and close, which meant he'd gone inside, which meant he was taking notes. He said, "The transferability clause is clean. I remember it. You were the signatory, and the transfer right is unconditional." I said, "In the IP agreement?" He said, "Did you sign it?" I said, "No." Long pause. He said, "Well, that changes things significantly. The thing about chefs is that the world thinks we're temperamental and impulsive. People who've never worked in a kitchen imagine us throwing pans and yelling about sauce consistency. And sure, that exists, but the best kitchen people I've ever known are actually the most organized people you'll meet. Because a kitchen runs on systems, and systems require documentation, and documentation requires the kind of detail, unglamorous attention to process that most people find boring right up until the moment they desperately need it. I had 17 years of documentation. I didn't do anything fast. That was important to me. Clifton expected me to either disappear quietly or make some kind of angry scene he could point to later. I did neither. I took 2 weeks. I organized my files. I had 3 conversations with Jerome. I had 1 long dinner with my wife where she listened to everything and said, "You're not doing this out of anger, are you?" And I thought about it honestly and said, "No. I'm doing it because it's right. Because those contracts exist for a reason, and that reason is that I did the work and nobody else did. And if that means something, it should mean something now." She nodded and refilled my glass and said, "Then do it correctly." I did it correctly. On a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the alignment meeting, I contacted our produce farm directly, spoke to the owner, a third-generation farmer named, well, he knows who he is, and I'd rather leave his family out of this, and explained that I was no longer with the restaurant group and that per the contract terms I was exercising my transfer right. He wasn't surprised. He'd been working with me personally for 11 years. He said, "Honestly, Russ, I've been waiting for your call. Where are you going?" I told him about the new venture. Not a restaurant, not yet, a culinary consulting and private events company. Intimate dinners, corporate chef's tables, menu development for independent operators who needed someone who knew what they were doing. Jerome had helped me incorporate it 6 days after I left. Russell Holt Culinary Group LLC, and I had been on the phone with former clients and colleagues steadily ever since. Because when you've been in one city's restaurant scene for 17 years, people know your name. And when word got out that I was available, the calls came faster than I expected. By the time I reached out to our seafood broker, word had already spread. She asked if I was the one who'd left 44th and Vine. I said yes. She said, "Well, we were going to call you anyway. The new management has returned a single invoice on time in 4 months." I transferred 3 of the 5 contracts. The other 2 I let lapse because Jerome advised me to be selective, and those 2 were the least critical operationally. The point wasn't to devastate anyone. The point was to clarify what I had built and what had been built with me. The recipe library was a different matter, and it required more care. Jerome drafted a letter to the group's legal counsel. It was not aggressive. It was precise. It outlined the history of my employment, the absence of the signed IP agreement, and my position that the recipes, formulas, and culinary documentation I had created during my tenure were my intellectual property under existing law. It invited them to present any counter-documentation they believed to be relevant. They didn't have any, because there wasn't any. Clifton called me 2 days after the letter arrived, not from his work number, from his cell phone on a Saturday afternoon, which meant either he was embarrassed or the legal team had told him to handle it informally first. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message that was trying very hard to sound calm, and mostly failing. He said there must be some misunderstanding. He said the recipes were part of the restaurant's identity. He said he really thought we could work this out like professionals. I called him back on Monday morning, office hours, my terms. I said, "Clifton, I've been professional about this. I've had legal counsel review everything. I'd like you to extend me the same courtesy." He said, "We built those recipes together." I said, "I'd be very interested to know which ones, because I have documentation on every dish going back to 2007, including my original test notes, and I don't recall you being in my kitchen during the development of any of them." Silence. He said, "This is going to create serious problems for the restaurants." I said, "You created those problems in the alignment meeting. I'm just responding to them." He asked if there was something I wanted, some arrangement that would resolve things. I said yes. Full written acknowledgement that the recipes and culinary documentation belonged to me. A licensing agreement for any recipes currently on your menus at a rate Jerome has already specified in the letter, and a correction to the severance calculation. Because when you factor in accrued vacation hours I never took in the last 3 years, your original number was short by $11,000. He went very quiet. I said, "You have the letter? Have your team review it." Then I said, "While I have you, you might also want to call your produce supplier. I think there's been a transition in account management they may not have told you about yet." I could hear him processing that. I let the silence sit. Then I said, "Good luck, Clifton. I mean that." I hung up and went to make coffee. The legal process took another 6 weeks, which is fast for that kind of thing because they didn't have a strong position, and Jerome is the kind of attorney who is extremely quiet right up until the moment you realize he's been 3 steps ahead of you the entire time. They contested the recipe ownership briefly, found they couldn't back it up, and agreed to the licensing terms. The vacation pay correction was non-negotiable, and they knew it. The produce contract transition caused a supply disruption at their main location for 11 days, during a period that included 2 private events they had already sold tickets to. I was told about this by a former prep cook who had my number and thought I'd want to know. I didn't gloat. I want to be clear about that. I had liked that restaurant. I had loved it actually, in the way you love something you built from almost nothing. Walking away had been hard enough. Watching it struggle didn't feel like a win. It felt like watching a house you renovated get painted the wrong color by the new owners. But here's what I knew, and what I had to hold on to. I had not done anything wrong. I'd shown up every day for 17 years. I'd fixed the problems, sourced the vendors, trained the cooks, written the menus, unclogged the drains. I had done the work right, every single time, because that's what my grandmother taught me when I was 16, and she put me to work in her church kitchen making Sunday suppers for 200 people. She said, "Russell, nobody remembers a shortcut. They remember a good meal." I had made a lot of good meals. In the months that followed, my consulting company grew faster than I'd projected. Word of mouth in the restaurant industry moves like fire. By the time spring came, I had 4 ongoing clients, 2 independent restaurants, a hotel looking to revamp their dining program, and a corporate client that wanted quarterly chef's table events for their executive team. I hired a former colleague to help me, a kitchen veteran of 30 years who'd been freelancing since a hotel chain had downsized him out of a job he'd held since the 90s. He came on board the first week of April. Good man, doesn't waste words. We signed our agreements the same day. I made sure this time that everything was in writing, everything was specific, and every name was spelled correctly. I kept my old chef's coat, the one with my name on the chest, the embroidery slightly uneven because the woman at the dry cleaner had done it by hand, and she'd said, "Sorry, I'm not a professional embroiderer," and I'd said, "It's perfect," and it was. I hung it on a hook in my home office next to a framed copy of the original 44th and Vine menu from 2006, the one I'd handwritten on a notepad and photocopied at the FedEx on 5th, because we couldn't afford a printer that worked yet. I didn't hang them as trophies, I hung them as reminders, that I had started with nothing and built something real, that the knowledge in my hands and my head and my files was never company property. It was just mine, and it had always been mine. And the day they handed me that severance folder with 2 months' pay and a request for my recipes was the day they accidentally reminded me of that. They thought they were ending something. They were actually just getting out of the way. 17 years I kept that kitchen alive. 17 years of 6 a.m. deliveries and midnight equipment failures, and training people who took what I taught them and carried it somewhere else, which is exactly what a good mentor is supposed to do. They wanted to call that a cost center. I called it a foundation. And when you spend 17 years building a foundation, you don't lose it when you walk out the door. You take it with you. I still have that chef's coat hanging in my office. Some mornings I walk past it without thinking. Other mornings I stop and look at the uneven embroidery, my name, stitched by hand by a woman who wasn't a professional and said so, and I said it was perfect, and I meant it, and I think about everything that coat was present for. Every 6 a.m. delivery. Every equipment failure at 11 on a Saturday night. Every new cook I trained who eventually left and took what I taught them somewhere else, which is exactly what's supposed to happen. What I learned from all of it isn't really about contracts or vendor agreements or IP clauses, even though those things mattered enormously in the end. What I learned is about the relationship between doing good work and protecting it. Those are two different things, and for a long time I only focused on one. I did the work right. My grandmother taught me that, and I never forgot it. But doing the work right is only half of it. The other half is understanding the difference between loyalty and invisibility, and knowing which one you're practicing. For 17 years, I told myself I was being loyal to something I'd helped build, and I was. But I was also allowing myself to become furniture, present, functional, unremarkable until something broke. Clifton walked into my kitchen and called it a cost center, and I was shocked. But I shouldn't have been entirely shocked. I had let myself be treated like infrastructure for years before he arrived. He just finally said the quiet part out loud. That's not self-blame, that's clarity, and there's a difference. Here's what I know now: the character to keep showing up, to fix what's broken, to train people honestly and source things carefully and stay when it's hard. That matters. It doesn't stop mattering just because someone in a quarter-zip pullover doesn't see it. But character alone isn't a business strategy. Jerome added that transferability clause in 2018 because I had the presence of mind to ask him to look at the contracts carefully, not because I assumed everything would be fine. The unsigned IP agreement existed because I had the discipline to question language that didn't sit right before I put my name on it, and then to follow through when I said I wanted it reviewed. Those weren't moments of aggression or cynicism. They were moments of clear thinking at times when it would have been easier to just sign and move on. That combination, the willingness to do hard work with genuine care, the intelligence to understand what you're actually holding, and the endurance to wait and act deliberately when the moment comes. That's what the whole thing came down to. Not anger, not luck. Russell Holt Culinary Group exists because of decisions I made years before I ever needed them. Decisions that required me to be paying attention when nobody was watching and nothing was on fire yet. My wife asked me if I was doing it out of anger, and I sat with that question honestly for a while before I answered because it deserved an honest answer. The truth was no. What I was doing was correcting a long-running imbalance, calmly and correctly, using tools I'd built through years of showing up and doing things right. The cause produced the effect. I had done the work, held the relationships, maintained the documentation. What followed was just what follows when you've actually been paying attention. They thought handing over my recipes meant they had what I'd built. They had the recipes. I had everything else.